A Bit Lit, celebrating creativity and research of all kinds.
Nedda, good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good too. Thank you very much. It's the evening for me, so I feel a bit like I've got horror movie lighting going on my end, but I'm pleased to see that the sun is rising for you.
Well, it's rising, but it's funny because in LA it's a little bit overcast for us, so it
Ah,
feels a little dim
British.
here. Exactly.
We start the films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about your work. So would you mind doing that, please?
I'd love to. So I teach at UCLA in writing programs, which is an interdisciplinary program that serves undergraduates and graduate students. And one of the wonderful things about teaching there is that because of its interdisciplinary nature, I get to do a lot of different kinds of things and work on different projects that excite me. There's a little bit of flexibility in that, and that has allowed me to sort of stretch my immediate areas of interest. So, I'm working on different projects that attend to different archives, but I guess the sort of uniting kind of theme for me is that I'm really interested and committed to working on social justice issues
Hmm.
and thinking about how the work that we do in the classroom and our research can have a larger impact. What directions can our work go in to have meaningful change or to inspire our students to think about the world in meaningful ways. My immediate sort of area of expertise is, of course, in the early modern period, and I'm interested in transnational networks, and I'm particularly interested in Safavid Persia and anything that relates to Safavid Persia. And Safavid Persia, just for people who might not be aware, is sort of the Persia of the early modern period if we're using European delineations. And I'm interested in um, studies of empire, critical race studies within that sort of specific field. I'm working on a variety of projects, including my monograph. I can talk a little bit about that. I don't want to just be talking at you, so stop me at any moment.
Bring it on.
Okay, so my monograph is tentatively titled "Translating Persia in Early Modern English Writing," and I essentially, in that project, am examining English fantasies of Persia and the literary imagination. So, English writers try to English Persia. So essentially translating these different texts about Persia in order to make them legible and accessible to English audiences. So we see a lot of translations of classical and biblical narratives that center Persia in some way, and these translations often inspired plays, poetry, prose texts, and in particular, the sort of Persia that they're translating is from the Achaemenid dynasty or the ancient Persian Empire from 550 to 330 BCE. And these ideas of Persia as sort of this fallen empire whose time has come and gone informed the travel expeditions from these European countries, particularly England, to Persia. And so travelers thought they were going to find this inert empire in ruins, but actually found this thriving metropolis with lots of different people coming together and doing trade. And so it kind of confused them because they weren't really expecting to find that. And also finding that the Persian rulers were actually really not interested in doing the kind of collaborative work or establishing exclusive trading rights with England. And that really kind of ultimately further delayed England's attempts to sort of expand its mercantile and imperial reach. So that's the sort of crux of the argument for the book project. And I'm of course working on other things too, but we can get to that a little bit later if there's time.
Yeah, let's come to those later and stop and unpack where we got to. So I was going to ask you to help us understand the phrase transnational networks, but in a way you've already done that by getting us thinking about that really interesting clash between the English fantasizing about an ancient civilization and then discovering that there is an IRL, real, right in front of them, civilization with needs and cultures and accomplishments that the English hadn't dreamt of. So I don't know if that's an example of the transnational networks that you were talking about. And then there's the Persian response to the English arrivals as well. So you've got these two different cultures trying to make sense of one another. Can we just start quickly with some really boring questions about dates? What sort of time period we're in here? You talked about the early modern period, and you raised the issue that that is itself a kind of a European periodization, a European way of understanding time here. So do you mind firstly giving us some sense of dates, and secondly, what time period does Persia think it's in when the English arrive?
That's a great question. We'll go backwards. I'm not really sure what Persia's thinking, because I'm really interested, obviously, in Persia, but I think I'm currently interested in the fantasies that England is producing about Persia, and that has a lot to do with, I think, some of the questions that come up in the work that I'm doing right now with these English fantasies of Persia resonate with a lot of the discussions that we might be having about Iran today. And so I'm really interested in what is the genesis of this, right? How do these perceptions and misconceptions about Iran, Persia come up? And I guess I'm just kind of beginning that or locating that in the early modern period. But with regards to dates, so the Safavid dynasty begins in 1501. And goes until the 1720s. I can't quite access the precise date where it ends. So it sort of expands a little bit further than what I think we would in the early modern studies in English literature kind of use as a guiding principle for early modern or Renaissance. Though it's close, it's, I think, stretches a little bit further.
But it sort of seems it starts then just after the Tudor period starts in England and lasts for twice as long as the Tudor period. So it has
right. And what's also interesting about it, and this kind of gets at the point that you were making in terms of just kind of clarifying what we mean by transnational networks. I think the interesting point that you brought up has a lot to do with the temporal, and there's a lot of confusion about time, because there's a way in which the Achaemenid Empire from 550 to 330 BC is always kind of present. And so even though England is encountering or thinking about Persia in the early modern period, there's always this sort of haunting of the ancient Persian Empire, this sort of desire to align or connect with the principles of that empire, because it was revered, but also kind of relishing in the fact that it's done and they don't have to worry about it as a competitive force. And so there's this sort of temporal and geographical complexity associated with Anglo-Persian relations.
Yeah, I wonder too if thinking of the current Persian Empire as the ancient Persian Empire is also a way of thinking about yourself as someone from an ancient Greek city-state taking on a kind of Herodotus-style set of Greek Persian wars. But it's a way of kind of valorizing yourself as one of the ancient Greek people that you've been told at university is, this is where culture is at. That maybe there's a way of kind of karaokeing the ancient Greeks.
Yeah, and I think that karaokeing is definitely happening with regards to Persia and English in English writing. There's a lot about Persia that interests England as it's imagining itself as expanding its empire. I mean, at the core of it, my project is really arguing that we can't understand England and its imperial ambition until we understand its relationship to Persia, because in many ways it's informing its sort of agenda according to Persian principles, Persian ideals, their ideas or understandings of Persia. So when they see Persia as not, the Persia that they imagined or had been reading about, it's very disorienting for the English travelers and writers.
So could you tell us more about that then? How is this sense of Persia fueling kind of early ideas of English imperialism?
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking about the wide audience that you have. So please stop me if something that I'm saying, because I'm so far into it.
Yeah.
I'm sure that I'll probably need to pause at certain moments. But the starting point really is these classical and biblical traditions that England is translating. And the primary idea that kind of guides this is the way that they understand empire, that is mapped out in the Bible, in the book of Daniel. So you have this process called translatio imperii, which translates to the transfer of empire. And the book of Daniel kind of describes, and I won't go into excessive detail about that story, because I think it's going to take up the entire conversation if I go into much detail. But essentially, the book of Daniel kind of describes that the beginning of civilization is Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, and that his empire will ultimately fall, and there will be these successive empires that aren't so much empires that kind of sit side by side, but rather the next empire comes and subsumes the original empire and kind of almost elevates it, or it becomes an extension of the next one. And then this kind of goes throughout history until the end of days. And England kind of imagined Persia as part of that tradition. And so they imagine themselves as, in some ways indirectly and in some ways directly, extending from Persia's empire, this sort of glorious past that they had. And that in many ways informed how they understood themselves and what Englishness meant. And this is sort of where the critical race studies part comes into my work, where they also kind of imagine themselves as a purer, whiter, more progressed, like kind of enlightened version of empire, that this empire is growing and developing over time. And so they are, it's very imperative then that Persia's time is over, because then that means that it gives them the space to kind of now assume their role as the enlightened telos. But of course, when they see that Persia is not really behaving like a dead empire, then it starts to complicate things. And we actually start seeing, whereas there's temporal distancing that happens in some of the earlier writings, meaning really casting Persia to the past and seeing themselves as the present or the future for English conception, we start seeing like a browning of Persians in narratives, in travel narratives, where we start to see phenotypic and behavioral sort of categories that Persians are assigned to, and then value judgments based on those categories. So then we start seeing more of like how we would understand race now in our critical studies, or critical race studies kind of frameworks.
So to make sure I've understood then, the English are thinking of Persia before they become familiar with its contemporary culture and identity. They're thinking of Persia as kind of almost like some form of ancestor, if not literally, then conceptually. But the moment they discover that Persian culture not only is thriving, but is thriving probably better than English culture, it's at that moment where racial othering becomes really important to the way that the English are fantasizing about Persians. Have I got that right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So I asked you about dates for Persian, Nedda. Do you mind telling us a bit more about at what point the English start to actually encounter Persian people, cultures, territory, and at what point they start to write about those encounters?
Yeah, so the Muscovy Company is really the sort of starting point. That was chartered in 1551. And what we start seeing is these expeditions, and Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations is really helpful here, because we get a lot of sort of extant documents that describe particularly Anthony Jenkinson. He was the sort of lead agent who went on these expeditions through a northern route into Russia, down the Caspian Sea, and then into Persia. And so we start seeing these documents kind of come about. So I count travel literature as literature, because these are fantasies of encounters. These are sort of, so that if we are thinking about travel literature as literature, then that's where we start seeing those writings emerge, post encounter, versus the, obviously classical and biblical tradition. And then in those expeditions extend for about 20 years across about 6 different expeditions. And each time these travelers, in the earlier ones led by Anthony Jenkinson, but these travelers are trying to create an exclusive Anglo-Persian agreement, because England thinks, oh, Persia is a really great place to kind of set down roots and then maybe go into other Eastern lands like India, maybe over to China. And so this would be a really great, fruitful place for us to kind of set up shop. But Persia is like, no, we're not interested. and so they just kind of keep going back to Persia, and Persia is just really uninterested. And then eventually they divert their attention to Ottoman Turkey, and then create some negotiations there, where then Persia kind of falls out of view for them for a period of time. So that's sort of like the beginning of where we start to see writings about Persia. We start to see actual encounters about Persia. But of course, English writers are writing about Persia much earlier than that, not based on their encounters, but based on what they're learning about these classical and biblical traditions.
Thank you. It's really fascinating because we so often think of Western exploration in this period as being Atlantic based, and I think if we thought that the English would be trying to trade with anyone in the Middle East, it would be the Ottoman Empire first, just by pure dint of kind of geographical proximity and well-established maritime routes. And to hear you talking about routes through Russia and the Caspian Sea, routes which are still water-based, but very much going through, this massive landmass. It's really fascinating to think about these different ways in which trade and travel is being remapped through this period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just so interesting. And I just kind of go back to your original point about transnational networks. What I love about the work that I get to do with Persia is that it really pushes beyond our understandings of encounter as a binary system where you have two terms encountering one another. And often in a Saidian sense, you have the sort of, more dominant group kind of imposing their ideas or desires onto the other group. But in Persia, we see more of that network. We see a lot of different kinds of people coming together. In the Safavid Empire, you had, English travelers, you had Italian travelers, you had Turks coming in to negotiate because the Turks and the Persians were actually really quite at odds with one another. You had Russians come. So there's a lot happening in this space that kind of informs what happens outside of Persia. And I just think that's really interesting because it kind of breaks apart, the maybe oversimplistic ways that we tend to think about what encounter looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really fascinating. Thank you. So you've given us a sense of the Muscovy Company and travels happening in the wake of its formation in 1591, and this idea of kind of 20 years worth of expeditions meeting Persians, and presumably then writing back to an English audience about that experience. Does that then prompt further fantasies about Persia on the part of English writers? I'm thinking particularly about, for example, playwrights. Do these travel narratives then prompt less immediate, non-eyewitness versions of fantasies about Persia?
Yeah, absolutely. But what's so interesting is that ancient Persia is always really front and center. So, for example, we see this fantasy of translatio imperii come up well into the 1600s, even in the 1700s, where we're seeing these sort of the remakings of plays or narratives about that kind of like dramatize the life of, Darius and Cyrus and Alexander, sort of coming in to conquer them. And so what's interesting, I mean, we do have some other documents too, like the Travels of the Three English Brothers that dramatizes the Shirley brothers' expedition into Persia beginning in 1598. These two brothers become sort of emissaries to the Persian Shah. And that there's a play about that dramatizes that, but we still see this fantasy, right, about ancient Persia. They don't want to let go of just sort of casting Persia to the past and really trying to understand its role as this sort of antecedent to English ideas of empire. So even though these encounters are happening, they just can't quite shake their desire to and obsession with ancient Persia.
Yeah, thank you. That feels like a real through story with all Western encounters, really, in whatever direction they happen to go in, is desperately trying to read things right in front of their eyes via classical and religious stories. Before we move on, Nedda, I should do my job as a bit lit host here to point viewers to other materials. So actually, you and I are speaking on a day where we just published a film with the UK broadcaster Samira Ahmed, partly talking about her TV program last year, The Art of Persia. And because it's out today, I even know that's film 106 for anyone looking for it. And I'm thinking particularly about that film, but also the film we made with Miles Greer about how long before England had an empire, how it kept dreaming and desperately wanting such an empire. And you're giving us an entirely new way of thinking about that kind of long history of fantasizing about an empire before it came along. You generously said we'd also talk about other projects. So I'm going to leave this with you now. We can keep talking about the book, which I really can't wait to read. But perhaps maybe you could bring us on to other projects too.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, so as I had mentioned earlier, I really am working on a variety of things. I'm actually working on a second book project. As we speak with Ambereen Dadabhoy, we're co-authoring a book called Anti-Racist Shakespeare for Cambridge University Press's Elements series, the Shakespeare and Pedagogy series in particular. And that's been a really great experience. And I think that kind of ties together this other sort of aspect of my growing interests. I've always been interested in teaching. That's always actually been a really big part of who I am as an academic since graduate school. And I, it's interesting because the work that I've been doing with Persia, I never really imagined myself as a Shakespearean, at least early on. I was sort of like, I don't really need to delve that deeply into Shakespeare. I've got this really rich archive that I'm working in. And interestingly enough, the work that I've been doing has shown me how Shakespeare and Persia are actually in conversation and in new ways for me. And I think I really credit, not just obviously what I've been learning when I do my own work on Persia, but also the work that I do with my students, and talking to them about Shakespeare and who he is, not just the plays themselves, but also just what he represents in the academy, what he represents in the canon, the sort of whiteness that is reproduced through assigning him, through learning him, through reading him. And that's kind of opened my eyes to a new set of ideas, and that are very much in the nascent stages, but some interesting translations of Shakespeare in Persian, and then like references that Shakespeare makes to Persia, and but this project with Ambereen is an opportunity to kind of dig more deeply into critical race studies and Shakespeare and the relationship between those two sort of topics, and at a time where I think people are very interested in it, but then also maybe to some extent a little bit wary of it as well. And so I'm really excited to be working on that.
Ambereen Dadabhoy, also a former a bit litter, so I point audiences to her film too. This is a huge question, so I apologize, but what does an anti-racist Shakespeare look like?
Well, you're going to have to read the book. No, just kidding. We're trying to figure that out. No, well, I think it's about, being more attentive to the kind of work that Shakespeare does, right? So, we often have been programmed to believe that race happens outside of whiteness, right? That race is what, you've got white and then you've got raced people. And so what critical race studies has been doing for some time is to draw attention to the fact that white is also a race, right? And we have to think critically about the kind of work that that's doing. And when we don't do that, we're doing a disservice to the study of Shakespeare. We're doing that a disservice to our students who we're teaching. So we really kind of at the starting point of this book are thinking about the whiteness of Shakespeare and what it means to teach him in a classroom, what it would mean to teach him without attending to that very important sort of aspect about him and his work, and what it means to kind of open the door to think about that. So, when we're teaching Shakespeare, and our students, particularly our students of color, are reading these narratives that depict, characters of color in a particular way, and then are told, well, Shakespeare's universal and he talks about the human experience. What message is that sending to our students, when we're not intervening and thinking more critically about what that means, right? What does it mean that this white man wrote Othello, for example, that this is really a white man's fantasy of what Blackness is, right? And really thinking critically about that, then we're not really attending to the work that the play is doing. So an anti-racist Shakespeare would be, or an anti-racist approach to reading, understanding, or teaching Shakespeare is to attend to the complexities of race and the different kinds of structures of power and domination that emerge when we're reading these materials, and then to kind of, shine a light on that, and then to get students to think more critically about these plays, to push back on that sort of idea of Shakespeare's universal.
Sounds fantastic, and I will do what you told me. I will go and read the book once it exists. But once it exists, Nedda, please do consider coming back to talk to us about it and telling us more once the book is out, because I know that our audience would love to hear more. Good luck with that. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
You mentioned tantalizingly, I think for lots of people who will listen to this film, potential links between Shakespeare and Persia.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling us a bit about that?
I don't mind telling you a little bit about that. I don't know how much I can tell you yet because it's in the nascent stages. But yeah, so there are. Right now, I have what I always tell my students, that when we write, sometimes we have to allow ourselves to just kind of play with ideas and just get them on paper, so that we have puzzle pieces to work with, and then we can kind of see what the larger picture is. So I think I have a few puzzle pieces and a few ideas of some puzzle pieces, but I don't yet have the full picture. And for example, I'm really interested in the image of the Hyrcanian tiger. Hyrcania is a region in Iran, and I'm interested in what is the difference between a tiger and a Hyrcanian tiger for Shakespeare, and what about the classical tradition that kind of describes this image and filters its way into Shakespeare's plays? To what extent is that Persianness emerging, and to what extent is that is it a random kind of inclusion, or is there some other kind of work being done there? So just a few questions for me about what is happening there. Or I found, when I was researching at the Folger, I found this really interesting translation or adaptation, really, in Persian, in the Persian language. And I want to be specific about that, because I don't know that it's a Persian text, meaning I don't know that it's by an Iranian. It could just be a Persian speaking individual in, let's say, India, or, what have you. So Persia was a very widespread language at the time, and lots of different regions would speak the language and write in the language in particular. But this Persian language text, that's a sort of adaptation of The Merchant of Venice. And I'm kind of working on that a little bit and trying to make sense of that, and this translation, this Persian text in Persian script that I found at the Folger Shakespeare Library. What is it doing there? Why is it there? And learning a little bit about this Scottish emissary who learned Persian when he was working as an English or an East India Company merchant, and found this play and translated it and brought it back to European readers. And so it's what's going on there, why is that happening? So again, questions, don't really have clear answers, but a lot of really interesting things that I'm finding and discovering, in some ways by accident. And I think just because of my orientations toward what I've been studying, and then the work that I've been doing with my students, that have kind of piqued my interest for future projects.
Yeah, it sounds great. I love the idea of The Merchant of Venice, with its very odd English fantasies about Venice and Jewishness, then being re-fantasized into the Persian language and then brought back by a Scottish merchant. That's completely fascinating. With the Hyrcanian tiger, I don't know the full history of that, but and you'll know this better than I do, but there's that moment in Virgil where Dido, who is trying to found an empire in North Africa, having traveled from the Middle East as a migrant, rounds on another migrant from the Middle East, Aeneas, on his way to found ancient Rome. And I think says that he's been brought up by a Hyrcanian tiger because of his poor dating skills, you know, because
Exactly.
he's been hanging out with her in a very suggestive manner, and now he's going away because he's a terrible man.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of that reference, if Shakespeare uses it. Like I say, I don't know if it's specific to Virgil or if it's a more general classical trope. But if it's specific to Virgil, it could be unleashing all kinds of things about gender as well as about race and about empire. And then you've mentioned the Muscovy Company as well. One of the things I'm interested in at the moment, because I'm working on animal baiting and bears in Shakespeare's time, is where on earth do you get a bear if you are running an animal baiting arena in London? And the Muscovy Company, I suspect, might be one of your answers. So I don't know if you'd be looking to source a Hyrcanian tiger if you were running some sort of weird London animal menagerie. But I like the fact that Hyrcanian tigers get us thinking both about those Muscovy Company shipping routes and about this very ancient literary tradition as well, all at once. There's so much going on there. It's really rich.
Yeah, which is why I have more questions, I think, than any of my answers. Because I think, when I started thinking about this project, I was like, I'll kind of quickly write this article up. Like, I'm sure it'll be really like just something I can work on the side, like on the weekends or something. And then the more that I would read about it, and the more I realized, oh no, I think this is going to actually be a much more involved project because, like you're saying, it's touching on so many different things. And I think I have to discover what I want to highlight, like what actually is the story here and what's really kind of happening. And I think it's going to be important to understand. This is part of the problem with working on what I'm working on, is that it's such a long, Iran has such a long history, and there's so many different elements that are kind of all important at the same time. And I can't always really separate it. And so it's the minute I read something, I realize there's an entire history that I don't know enough about that really is actually informing that moment. So I think that what I've discovered is this reference to the Hyrcanian tiger is kind of doing that work again for me. And so I found myself at another really complex project, which I think is part of the fun of it.
Absolutely. Good luck. I'm really excited to see where that project goes. I'm really looking forward to it. Nedda, we end our films by asking our contributors what the word literature means to them. And I'm realizing now I forgot to warn you about this before we started filming. So I'll try and ask this in a long-winded way so you have time to think. But we're interested in knowing where the word literature sits in the vocabulary of the people we speak to, whether that be personally or professionally. And I guess in your case, perhaps from the point of view of the English travelers and or from the Persians that they encounter. I don't know. But yeah, what does that word mean to you?
I think the best way to maybe start thinking about that for me is, so my relationship to literature is informed, I think, by Iran's relationship to literature, and the kind of impact that had on me as a young girl growing up, and the way that my parents raised me and kind of enfolding me in Persian narrative and literature and story, not just the stories, but also talking about the power of that literature and what it does. And I think that makes me kind of remember. So there's this English translation of one of my favorite stories that I haven't read from cover to cover because it's so long, and in poetic Persian. So that's just like almost like a different language altogether. But there's an English translation of Abul Qasim Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which is roughly translated to the Book of Kings by Dick Davis. And this narrative is an epic poem from the medieval period, and is arguably the most important piece of literature in Iranian history. And I think a large part of why people believe that, Iranian and non-Iranian, is because this this piece of writing is sort of setting to verse the oral histories and mythologies of Persia's past, in sort of the wake of, I mean, a few centuries later, but in the wake of, or as a response to the Arab invasion of the 7th century that essentially erased or tried to erase our language, our history, our religion. And so Abul Qasim Ferdowsi sort of setting this work down using Avestan, mostly Avestan Persian, or our original Persian language, was a way to sort of preserve that language in the face of this kind of invasion. And the famous novelist Ozar Nafisi, who wrote Reading Lolita in Tehran, has a foreword to this English translation of this poem. And her story in that foreword always really resonated with me. And the first time I read it, it kind of brought me to tears, because it made me think about what I learned as a child. And she describes how her father translated, or sort of made an adapted version of this poem for a children's audience, to make it accessible for kids. And that she describes kind of sitting at her desk and seeing both Dick Davis's copy and her father's copy, and remembering her father telling her the story that, you know, Iran has experienced so many invasions throughout all of the years of its history, and so it's poetry that is the guardians of its history. That the boundaries of our country have changed so much over the years, but that is what Iranianness is. That is who we are. And so for me, I feel that that's, I guess, the best way to think about literature, at least for me, in terms of how I grew up and what I learned and why I got into this gig, is really because I feel that there's the power, there's power in that, and that there's something about the human condition that we can access in these stories. And I think my hope, or my interest, my goal, is to engage with my students in that way, to treat my scholarship in that way, and to just really kind of think about the humanity of people through these stories, and selfishly for me, to learn more about my roots and my history through this work.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I love the idea that poetry is the guardian of history. And I should say too that Samira Ahmed, in that film documentary she made of the art of Persia, talked about reading that poem as she made the film each night, and how important that was to the filmmaking that they were doing. I think they were the first film company from Britain allowed into Iran to make a full-length documentary, and how that poem kind of acted as a kind of key for getting access to certain parts of the world that they were filming. Nedda, I think that resonates really beautifully. The idea of poetry as the guardian of history through everything that we've discussed today. And in some ways, it would be easy to think about the English fantasizing about Persia as a kind of anti-guardian of history, as something which is troubling history. But the work that you're doing also is, by giving us a history of those fantasies, doing a really important job of clearing them away, acknowledging them, clearing them away. And as you said right at the outset, acknowledging and interrogating the way that myth-making about Iran in particular is still an issue with which we need to grapple. So I'm going to think too of your scholarship as the guardian of history, and close the film by saying thank you. Oh no, don't. Well, no, you're welcome to cry. I was about to give a very male response, going, "Oh no, don't cry." Crying is allowed. But yeah, thank you so very much. Your work is fascinating, and I can't wait to read the many books which are about to come our way.
Thank you so much. It's been fun chatting with you.
Take care.